Hello and welcome to our Syxsense February Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday release. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after.
Thank you, Johanna, and a very warm welcome to everybody in a very special month. For many people, it's the February Patch Tuesday. Welcome to everybody for joining us today. We've been doing this webinar now for just over 2 years, and in that time, we've seen many vulnerabilities that actually sometimes get hidden under the radar. So there are a few vulnerabilities we're going to bring to your attention today, maybe some that haven't actually got the priority or the severity that you might have thought, and we're going to bring some of the industry priority knowledge to you as well to show you how we in managed services have been able to deploy over 100 million patches over the last decade to our managed services customers. Now, to start off with, we're going to look at some news, and there is actually a common theme with the news, being that a lot of all three of these have now come end of life, and that's a very, very serious vulnerability if you have operating systems or applications that are still used in your environment that are end of life. It means you will not get any more patches from the vendor. So the first one is Windows 10 21H1. That's now end of life as of last month, so there are no more updates available going forward. As well as last month, we lost support for Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 as well. So if you still have those operating systems, you must migrate to a new operating system, or in fact, install the next feature update for Windows 10. Google released version 110, and unfortunately that came without support for Windows 7 and 8.1 as well. The last supported version for Windows 7 and 8.1 was the last one, which was 109. Once again, you are not going to receive updates for Google Chrome. And so far this year, we've had a few weaponizations. Last year, I think we had 15 versions of Google Chrome that resolved a weaponized vulnerability. Super, super serious. If you have these, please go ahead and upgrade. If you can't, maybe you should find another browser. As is Internet Explorer. It was end of life, and not only is it end of life, but in the latest release, the cumulative updates for Windows 10, certain versions of those cumulative updates will actually now uninstall or effectively disable Internet Explorer completely. That's Internet Explorer 11. For that, they haven't mentioned exactly which cumulative versions, but we suspect it's for Windows 10, Standard, Pro, potentially even Education. The Enterprise might actually get a few more months, but please, if you are using these operating systems, do some testing. Make sure if you still rely on Internet Explorer, and there are still many legacy applications that are still on Internet Explorer, do the testing before you deploy. Microsoft is saying you should go to Edge, and they're obviously building in a lot of their AI with the Bing browser, that Edge actually is, from a Microsoft perspective, the browser of choice to replace Internet Explorer. We also had a week and a half ago quite a lot of out-of-band updates. Now this came as a result of the December Patch Tuesday updates. Now, Microsoft has identified that an issue with XPS displays were being caused by the December 2022 cumulative security updates. So this was from December. Users will experience a null reference exception and images with glyphs displayed incorrectly when viewing XPS documents rendered using the affected Windows Presentation Foundation based applications. So it is impacting Windows 10 and Windows 11 with a couple of servers as well, for .NET Framework 3.5 all the way up to 4.8.1. So if you are using those .NET frameworks. Now, it mentions that it's an out of band, but it doesn't really resolve a security vulnerability. It's more of an incompatibility. So I would highly recommend that if you didn't go ahead to resolve those out of band updates from a week and a half ago, that you now include those in the latest release, because if you have deployed the updates in December, potentially your users might be impacted. Adobe we found out through our Microsoft partnership with MAP that Adobe were not going to release an Adobe Reader update yesterday, but they did release the largest set of fixes for all of the other Adobe products, from After Effects all the way down to Substance 3D Stager. Why would Adobe not release probably their most popular product, a patch for it? We can only assume that it hasn't finished testing yet. Usually there always is an Adobe Reader update. So if there is going to be an Adobe Reader update in the next couple of days, it might get released as an out of band, and we'll need to look if there are security fixes in that patch in order to identify whether we need to immediately roll that out. From what you see here, there are none that Adobe have suggested have an immediate need for deployment. So the immediate need is within 3 days, and then the next is within 2 weeks. So you have 2 weeks to roll these out, and that's the normal severity from Adobe. And finally, Mozilla. Mozilla did release their new version 110, including Firefox ESR. This actually came via the CISA alert. So we're kind of keen on listening to CISA. They said that an attacker could exploit these vulnerabilities to take control of an affected system. So if you do have Mozilla Firefox in your environment, if it is the corporate browser of choice, then it should be updated immediately. And finally, Patch Tuesday. We had not such a huge release. We had 20 updates less than we did in January. We had 75, which is kind of making sense. If you followed us from the end of last year, where December didn't have a preview release, means they didn't get as much exposure to the patch testing as they would usually have had. So as in January, they obviously released a lot of extra updates, and it's sort of settled down now. Of the 75 fixes, we had 9 that were critical and 66 which were important. It's still quite very high. You know, the middle of last year, we were having 50, 60 updates fixed. It kind of dropped from the hundreds that we were seeing earlier on in the year. But there still is a lot of very important vulnerabilities to target this month, especially if you're deploying based on a severity. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Windows 7 is gone, so we're not going to touch that. But Windows 2008 R2 does have 1 more year left for the ESU Year 4 extension. That had 33 fixes, 3 of which were critical. We had 3 weaponized fixes. Very serious vulnerabilities. I'm going to talk more about those in a second. Of the 3 weaponized vulnerabilities, none were public aware, which is actually really good. So you only know how to weaponize it if you know. That's the way to think of it, like that. But we did have 7 jump points. Last month we had just a couple, but here we have 7. Jump points are specific where a vulnerability, if exploited, can move within the technology and out of the technology of the original exploitation. So if you could hack a browser, you could jump out of the browser into the operating system. If you have a VMware or a hypervisor and you can attack the host, you can jump into the guest and vice versa. That's what we call a jump point. Extremely, extremely serious. So for our security aware clients, a lot of clients will insist that jump points are always resolved. We have 7 of those, and we're going to talk about some of those as well today. And this is something we added in the last webinar, and we had so many great messages and feedback. We're going to leave it in. We actually find this really interesting. So when you're looking at a release from Microsoft, they break down the types of bugs that they're fixing. And there's actually several different types of bugs. And what's, from an analysis perspective, the number one type of bug that's resolved is usually elevation of privilege. It's usually the highest, but in this release, we have an extraordinary amount of remote code execution vulnerabilities, which have 34 fixes. Now, remote code execution vulnerabilities is a class of cyber attack in which attackers can remotely execute commands to place malware or to do other malicious code activity on your devices or on your network. It's serious, and actually it's probably just under 50% of the vulnerabilities that are fixed have that type of bug. So we think it's quite interesting from an analysis perspective. Elevation of privilege vulnerabilities have 12 fixes. That's where a threat actor gains access to an employee's account, or they can bypass improper authorization channels and successfully grant themselves access to the data that they're not supposed to have. Denial of service is the attack to cause a resource to use all of the available resources on the system, making it inaccessible. There were 10 fixes of those. Information disclosure vulnerability, there were 8 of those. That's where a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information, such as user names or email addresses. Spoofing vulnerabilities, there were also 8 of those. That's when that's the act of disguise. It's making something look like something it's not supposed to. Typically, that's the kind of thing that you get those emails and you click on them because they look like a genuine internal communication. And then security feature bypass vulnerability with 2 of those. Actually, there were 8 of them in the last Patch Tuesday. Now there's only 2. That's when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms of a device to gain unauthorized access. Of course, Microsoft put those protections in place if you can bypass them, or if you can access the hard drive, if it's encrypted, for example. That's an extremely sensitive vulnerability that we should be prioritizing. So let's take a look at how we're going to prioritize Patch Tuesday. Now, again, if you're familiar with the webcast, we don't put everything into a slide deck. We want you to have access to the very latest data. But to prioritize Patch Tuesday, we use a number of factors that allow us to decide, based on the data, which vulnerability is more serious than the others. And we actually use 6 factors that are publicly available, but inside Syxsense are all recorded to allow us to make that decision. The first is the vendor severity. Of course, the vendor severity, they're the ones that have produced the patch. And sometimes the vendor severity from critical, high, medium, low is not exactly the same as an independent severity score, which we use CVSS, which runs from 10 to 0. But when you combine the 2 together, you do get a more accurate severity assumption based on those 2 or one of those alone. So by having both of these together, we're able to make an assumption about the medium severity risk of that vulnerability. Then we got the state of the vulnerability. This is not available in many products, but our researchers are always looking for evidence of weaponization and public aware. Now, weaponization is where a vulnerability has actually been used to exploit, typically through our partnerships with the antivirus organizations and with Microsoft directly. We're able to find that there is evidence, sufficient evidence, where a vulnerability is being used to exploit. And when that does happen, it doesn't always change the severity of the vulnerability. If you can imagine the amount of data that Microsoft and NIST have to sift through on a daily basis, something becoming weaponized doesn't always make the score or the severity change. And we think that that's not actually quite true from a risk perspective. If something becomes weaponized, it definitely should, which is why we have it as part of the 6 factors we use to score a vulnerability. Public aware does not mean it's weaponized. Public aware means that the precise method, potentially through a bug bounty program, potentially through YouTube or other tier 1 and tier 2 public announcements, somebody has said exactly how to expose a vulnerability to inflict your attack. Public aware doesn't always lead to weaponization. This is very interesting. It's one factor. Public aware means that the exact blueprint is available, but sometimes those steps to follow are actually really quite complex. And obviously, if you were trying to lay an attack, you would try to have those steps as easy as possible to follow. However, who wants to be the IT manager that could have seen that something was public available to be exploited and didn't do anything about it? So that's why that is our fourth factor when we're prioritizing vulnerabilities. Now we need some balance. So this balance is our countermeasure. And often vendors will release two types of countermeasure. The first being a workaround. So if you can't take a big patch, maybe the patch is 2 gigabytes in size, is very normal now, or maybe 1.5 gigabytes in size. Maybe you can't deploy that quickly in a highly distributed network. So you have a workaround. The workaround may be a registry key, or you could stop a service, or you could do something to the device to effectively get around the need to so urgently roll out a big update. If you know the update requires a reboot, for example, and your reboot schedules are once per week, then maybe the countermeasures should be used, and via Syxsense you can deploy those. Or maybe you've got a mitigation being that there is a highly sophisticated antivirus that's actually stopping that type of exploit from happening. It's very important that you are aware of having all of this access to the data so that you can make the decision on what you're going to prioritize. If you know that your countermeasures are in place, whether you can deploy the workaround or you already have a mitigation, it releases the priority down so you can focus on the other vulnerabilities that are most important. Of course, the last thing is your exposure. Because you have something very serious on 1 or 2 of your machines does not mean that's your priority. Really, it shouldn't mean it. It means it should be prioritized, but not your most urgent. You may actually have another set of vulnerabilities that are less severe, maybe with weaponization on 50, 60, 70% of your estate. That's probably where your focus should be. And what we're going to do is show you the priority in the order we've just laid out here directly on our site so that you can make the decision which patches you're going to deploy. What you have to do is take the patches of recommendation, pop them into the tool set you're using, and if you have an exceptional exposure, then they need to be deployed as urgently as possible. So let's go ahead and take a look at our recommendation. And again, we put this on to our sites, syxsense.com. If you notice along the top here, we've got a resources page. So under the resources center, we also have news pages and events as well. Those can all be accessed and get the live Patch Tuesday recommendation, which actually was released yesterday. You can also talk to our techies if you have any questions about subscribing to this particular webinar or any of our other webinars such as Zero Trust. You can actually just message us and we'll send you through the link to get that webinar live. And if you do want any suggestions on a patching process, you can also ask for that as well. So through our resources page, you'll actually find our Patch Tuesday links that will be published on the Tuesday, every single Patch Tuesday. And we have a little write-up as well to go through some of the vulnerabilities that we're going to cover today. Now, one thing I did notice when I looked through the data, not only did I see a lot of weaponization, we actually had 300% more weaponized fixes in this release, and as we did last month, but we also had 5 vulnerabilities which have a CVSS score of more than 9. So if you remember, the CVSS score is the independent score. It leaves from 10 being the very most serious, 0 being the least serious. We haven't actually seen any vulnerability with a 9.0 or above since October of last year. So very, very serious. To target those, we also have some weaponizations that we're going to recommend as well. And just because I'm a data person, I like to look at the evidence. I actually like to compare Patch Tuesday risk to other Patch Tuesday risk. It's very important also for February, because it's such a small month. You have less time than you usually do to roll out your updates. So prioritizing your updates is more important now than it's ever been. But what I've tried to do is just to work out what's the comparison from January to February. And what I did is I counted up all of the CVSS scores for all of the vulnerabilities, and it actually came out at 565.9. So that's the total CVSS score for February. I thought it was quite interesting. And it's almost half of what we had in January, because in January we had so many more updates. Since December, we didn't have any previews available. So you have half the vulnerabilities as a risk to resolve this month, but you have less than 2 weeks to finish from now to the end of February to get those deployed. So still a lot of work to do. The first one I'm going to recommend is CVE 2023-21823. This is a Windows graphics component. It's an elevation of privilege vulnerability, and it's with the Win32 kernel driver. Now, we've actually seen this quite a lot, and if you followed us, this elevation of privilege vulnerability with the Windows graphics, specifically around the Win32 kernel driver, it's actually popped in a couple of times. And this would indicate that maybe hackers are trying to exploit this as best they can. What is interesting about this is the vendor, Microsoft, actually only set this as an important severity, even though it's extremely high and sensitive and is weaponized. It has a CVSS of 7.8, and there are no countermeasures. If you can exploit it, they're able to gain system privileges. So very, very important for that. There's the risk, the 6-score risk we call, which is from the CVSS as well. The attack vector is local, so you do need to have local network access. It cannot come across a network, across the internet, but it does have low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction, and it doesn't have a jump point. The second is also a repeat offender, CVE 2023-23376. This is the Windows Common Log File System driver. It is also an elevation of privilege vulnerability. And once again, if they can exploit this, they could gain system privileges. Similar to the previous one, this is a risk factor of local with a low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction, and doesn't have a jump point, but it is weaponized. So it is my second highest priority. And my third is CVE 2023-21715. This is a Microsoft Office security feature bypass vulnerability. And this is where an attacker who successfully exploited the vulnerability could bypass your macro policies used to block untrusted or malicious files. So extremely serious. For the last 2 months, Microsoft have been increasing the security of macros. Obviously, macros can be used to automate things, and back in the day, they used to be the go-to thing for viruses and what is now called a ransomware. Where you could attack the system, encrypt files, and generally just cause carnage. But if you're able to bypass this, the setting inside your Office apps, whether that's Excel or Word, of course, you're able to effectively do anything you like. The sort of outcome is endless. That does have an attack vector of local, so you have to have local network access from one device to another. It has low attack complexity, low privileges, but does require user interaction. So it does require the user to be involved in that attack. And hopefully your users know they shouldn't be clicking any links. If they receive any emails or any internal Teams or DMs, they shouldn't be clicking links unless they know exactly where it's come from. Now, the rest of the vulnerabilities from Patch Tuesday is listed down here in our opinion as priority. But I would like to draw your attention past the first three I've just mentioned to the next five, which have the CVSS score of 9.8. We'll actually take a look at a couple of these. Now, the first three of these, or four of these, Microsoft is actually saying exploitation is more likely. Sorry, the first three is more likely. So if Microsoft is saying this is more likely, this one should be prioritized first, then this one here, which is your Word remote code execution vulnerability, this one they're saying is slightly less likely. But we're going to talk about these very quickly. We have a couple of more minutes left. This one is the Microsoft Protected Extensible Authentication Protocol. You actually see why I'm highlighting this. It's extremely important. It has a CVSS of 9.8. It can attack over any network, which means internet as well. So you can attack systems not just on your own local network, but actually across the internet with a low attack complexity, no privileges, no user interaction, and luckily it doesn't have a scope or a jump point. The reason I mention this is because not many people, including myself, until I read up what this actually does. So this extensible authentication protocol is basically an architectural framework that provides the authentication methods for commonly used protected network access technologies like IEEE, wireless, 802.1x and point-to-point protocol, which is used in VPNs. Hence why I thought this is extremely important. If you have users at home, obviously a lot of users did go to home working over COVID. Not many customers we know have gone fully back to a office-based and maybe are still using a VPN in this case. Please, if you have this in your environment, this is a Microsoft update, a CVSS of 9.8. Please ensure that this is as prioritized as quick as you possibly can. After the weaponization, this will be your next priority. And then finally, this one, the other one I mentioned, CVE 2023-21716. It also has a CVSS score of 9.8. It has attack vector of network, which means any network access, local and internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges, no user interaction, and luckily for us, it doesn't have a jump point. It doesn't have a jump point. Now, one thing I noticed about this one is there is a couple of workarounds, which is actually really good. And what they're saying is this particular KB article for this particular vulnerability shows you how you can enable file block and how to configure the trusted exempt folders, which is good from a workaround perspective. But why have I chosen this as my fifth most important vulnerability? And actually, it's actually this. A lot of users, including myself, have within Outlook or within Windows the preview pane. I just want to see what's in something. I don't really want to open it up. I don't want to download it. I just want to see what it is and then move to my next email. Well, usually the preview pane is quite protected. So you've got a document, you click on it, you can read inside it, but it doesn't actually open it. And usually an attack like this requires you to physically open up the document so that the attack can be presented and obviously infected. But this is not the case with this vulnerability. The preview pane is an attack vector. So unfortunately, if you did just look at an email that had an attachment in it, the preview pane would then launch the attack on your system. So I think it's incredibly important that this one is used, especially if you're very busy like I am and the rest of my team. We generally see an email, look at it, and we decide to work on it later. So again, there's a few top 5 that I'd highly recommend that you prioritize. Please, if you have any questions whatsoever, send us a message. We'd be delighted to help you with any questions or patching strategies you have. Everything's up on the site. And of course, if you're not a Syxsense customer and you would like to see how we might be able to help you control your patching or your security vulnerability systems, your Windows and Linux and Mac, please get in touch. We look forward to speaking to you. And until March, I hope everyone has a great rest of this month. And until then, happy patching. I'll pass you back to Johanna.
Thank you, Rob. Have a great day, everyone.